All right. So it is 6 p.m. at this moment. Unconscious of time, we should begin the session. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining the first webinar hosted by the Toronto Chinese Business Association in collaboration with the Young Executive Network in response to COVID-19 recovery for small and medium-sized enterprises. My name is Megan Ip, and I'm the president of the Young Executives Network. Without further delay, I would like to introduce a very special guest this evening. So we have Mayor John Tory of City of Toronto and Raymond Chin, First Vice President of the Toronto Chinese Business Association, as well as Festival Chair for the 2021 Toronto International Dragon Boat Race Festival, who will be moderating the session this evening. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Raymond, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Megan. As Megan said, my name is Raymond Chin, and I am a VP at the Toronto Chinese Business Association and the Festival Chair for the Toronto International Dragon Boat Race Festival. Let me first thank all of those who worked tirelessly to put on this event. So Gilbert Wong, our event chair, Megan Ip and Cindy Lee, our Young Executives Network President and VP, Teresa Chi, our TCBA President, and Bella Bao, our TCBA Administrator, just to name a few. And of course, most of all, a man who needs no introduction, our Mayor John Tory. From when he first took office in 2014, he has consistently had Torontonians' best interests and needs in mind. It would take the entire hour, if not longer, to list the many projects and city initiatives that Mayor Tory has thrown his weight and support behind. But I can confidently say that he has made the City of Toronto a much better place for all of us. Because of his leadership, we can easily see that great future ahead. Obviously, 2020 has been a year of immense challenges, but clearly the overarching issue that is in all of our minds and is the topic of tonight's conversation is COVID-19. With almost 60 million cases and close to 1.4 million deaths worldwide, COVID-19 is clearly a worldwide pandemic and has been an example of how globalized our world has become. More locally, our provincial numbers have been in the range of 1,500 new cases per day, with Toronto making up about a third of that each day over the past few weeks. These numbers are obviously worrisome, but I'm confident that our government at all levels are making the right and difficult decisions to steer us back on course while we plan for the world to get back to normal. As an example of these difficult decisions that were needed, the City of Toronto just went into a 28-day lockdown today. It isn't all doom and gloom though. Within the past few weeks, we have heard promising news from large drug makers that an effective vaccine is on the horizon. The timeline and overall future of this pandemic is up to the powers and people higher than both of us, and this is the backdrop of our conversation today. Over the past few weeks, our event team for this fireside chat has solicited questions from the TCBA community and beyond. Questions have come from those in the industry and those affected by the industries alike. Our team has had a chance to pare down the list, and I have a set of questions that we'd like to focus on for our conversation tonight. I'd also like to add that we took the questions last week. Obviously, since then, the City of Toronto and Region of Peel have announced a lockdown, so I may slightly reword the questions, but try to keep the context. With that, I'd like to pass it on to Mayor Tory for a few comments before we start our questions. Mayor Tory?
Well, Raymond, thank you, and Megan, thank you, and Cindy, thank you, and one and all who are present for this webinar, thank you very much. And may I begin by saying I've got my fingers crossed for the Dragon Boat race for 2021, because I think if we're able to proceed ahead with that, it's a good indication, that things are much better by the time we get to next spring. And, I'm dearly hoping that, not just because there's going to be a vaccine on the horizon, which I gather is, promising, but just because I think everybody's been through a lot. And, I want to fasten on some other words that Raymond spoke, which is that, he was complimentary enough of me to say that I try to make decisions on the basis of what is best for the people of Toronto. I have had a lot of interesting jobs in my day, previously in government, but more importantly, in some ways in business, running a big company and things like that. And I have never faced decisions that were as difficult as the ones that have been faced during the course of this pandemic. And that is because every decision you make has multiple sides to it. I mean, you worry about the effect it's going to have on people, individual people. Of course, you worry about the effect it's going to have on business, but overarching all of that has to be, what is the best thing you can do with respect to preserving health and saving lives in the city and protecting the healthcare system. And I can only say to you that, while you might say, well, it's easy to decide which policy, which approach, which kind of restriction will do the most to save lives, to protect health, and to protect the healthcare system. It's not easy because this is a virus, as you all know, that was discovered basically 11 months ago. There are still probably more unknowns than are known about it. And so you do your best based on the best evidence, the best advice you can get from experts, and based on what's going on in the rest of the world, best practices. And, I feel really badly about the lockdown that the province announced on Friday. I feel really badly about it because it's going to disrupt people's lives. But of course, it's going to do damage to businesses, some of which are represented, of course, on this very call. But at the same time, I don't comfort myself in seeing this, but I at least recognize the fact, as I hope you do, that pretty well every other major city, global city in the world has had a lockdown or some kind of a shutdown or partial shutdown like this, in order to, because that is, I guess, the best assessment of the people who give the advice as to what's going to help us stop numbers that were truly alarming. If you looked at I think you may have heard the medical officer of health saying today that 45% of all the COVID-19 cases that we've had in the city of Toronto have happened since October the 1st. So that's in a sort of a 6-week period out of a total of 10 months, 45% of the cases have happened. That was an alarming kind of trend. The growth in the case numbers, as you know, was increasing, the acceleration. The hospitals were starting to get some pressure on them. Our hospitals were better off than, say, in Peel, but they were starting to get some real pressure. And of course, with the kind of exponential growth, it's a very short matter of time before the hospitals are under such pressure that not only can they not care for the COVID people, but anybody who might have a heart condition or a stroke or a cancer operation can't be dealt with either. And then you're into the kind of chaos we've seen elsewhere. I have been a relentless advocate for programs to assist business. I think Chrystia Freeland would tell you that I'm probably one of her most frequent phone callers and texters. I spoke to her as recently as this morning. I, as you may saw, was after the Senate because I thought it was inexcusable. Frankly, they took a break week, as they called it, and didn't pass in one day the legislation that now people can apply for now, a week later, to get rent relief and to get wage subsidies to be continued. But those programs are there. The provincial programs are there. And I hope now they can both get, as I say, get the money out the door as soon as possible because businesses need that money to help them to survive. And I'm not going to speak for too much longer, but I also spoke today about the fact that I really want to make sure we do everything we can from the standpoint of traffic management to make sure this curbside option, together with online sales by local businesses as distinct from big businesses, can be a viable option so that people actually can make. I know they'll generally say when you can only have curbside or, that kind of thing, it'd only be like 10% of the sales. But I think we'd love to get that up to a much higher number by saying to people, the curbside option really is practical. The online option really is practical, and really push that so that people will think to use that. So I will stop there. I just want people to know, though, most of all, first of all, that I appreciate the contribution you make. I appreciate the number of jobs that you create, and I appreciate the damage that this entire pandemic and some of the restrictions meant to end it are causing you. I think you all know that there wouldn't be anybody in their right mind, least of all Doug Ford or myself, who would sit in our office and consciously try to think up ways in which we could resolve the pandemic on the backs of business people and sort of say, who cares about them? Too bad for them. It's been exactly the opposite. We've been trying to find every way we can to avoid that kind of situation, but it got to the stage in the last couple of weeks where we were faced with what I believe would have been a much longer and much broader and therefore much more damaging shutdown in the winter if we didn't act now to try and stem the tide of these numbers that were taking place. So I'm looking forward to your questions, no matter what they may be, and I'm quite prepared to accept criticism because that's in the nature of my job. But I do appreciate the fact you've given me this time this evening, and let's get on with the show.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Torrey. So first question, we'll just hop right into it. I will sort of give a little bit of context to the questions, and I'll kind of mention who they're from or what industry they're from, and I hope maybe with that it'll help a little bit with the context of why somebody's asking that question. So our first question, Mayor Torrey, is a question from one of our TCBA partners. With the rise in cases and current restrictions, what is the city doing to ensure compliance by restaurants and bars? You know, the original question was asking about patios and how they often look like they're not in compliance, but maybe I'll reposition that a bit to be about the outside lineups and making sure that they're compliant, and maybe mask wearing, whether that's compliant since it's locked down and the restaurants really aren't open anymore.
So that's a really good question, and there would be a time when I could have a fireside chat with you, and you'd be saying to me, "These inspectors are driving me crazy, coming around all the time to do the health inspections, and why don't you tell them to busy themselves doing something else?" And I think maybe because I think our inspectors are not people who want to try and push people out of business. They generally give a fair number of warnings to people. We even have in the restaurant rating system, it doesn't go straight from green to red. And all that sort of thing. But what's happened during the pandemic is I think that kind of culture of giving people a lot of warnings and that kind of general practice in terms of how the law is enforced has been followed now for what I'll say is 11 months. And I've expressed there 10 months. I've expressed the view publicly, so you've probably heard me say so. The time for warnings is over. But I don't direct the law enforcement. We have a very good separation here in Canada between politicians and law enforcement, and the politicians do not tell the law enforcement people what to do, when to charge people, when not to charge them. And I think that's a good thing. It's a part of our democracy. However, I have been expressing my opinion more and more loudly in the last couple of months because I felt that by the time we got 6 or 7 months into this, the time for warnings was over. I'm pleased to tell you that I think as a result of the fact that with the numbers getting worse and worse, people started to realize the stakes were higher here. And I tried to find the sheet and I just couldn't before we started today, but I will tell you, going from memory, about 90 restaurants were inspected this past weekend alone. There were, I think, 17 charges laid, which is an unusually high number. In previous weekends, it's been like 2 or 3 with a whole bunch of warnings given out. There were some warnings given this weekend. Private parties, which I realize is not what the question was about. I think there were about 50 or something of those complaints that were investigated by the police and by the bylaw people, and they gave some tickets and charged some people, and they're pretty hefty fines. So I think they're on to the fact now. I guess they heard my opinions. I'm not sure what influence, if any, that had, but I think what they've really figured out, the bylaw people and the police, is that if we're going to say the situation is so serious that we're actually going to cause businesses like yours, those on the call tonight, to be closed, more or less, subject to curbside pick up and takeout, then we've got to say those who are transgressing that is, first of all, it's unfair to the rest of you who are following the rules. And secondly, it's just thumbing your nose at the law. And so I think you're going to see that this weekend's enforcement pattern, which was more numerous inspections, more numerous charges, fewer warnings, is going to be followed going forward. That's my sense from hearing from the law enforcement people. And they don't, as they say, ask me if that's okay. They just tell me that's what they're doing. And I have to sort of express my opinion and let them move on. So I think the point is taken. With regard to the lineup management, I think this is a very, very important thing the private sector is going to have to take on. And I say that with regard to restaurants, but also even more so the kind of some of these bigger stores that have been allowed to stay open and so on. The government doesn't have enough people to go around to every store and make sure that they're responsibly handling lineup management. And so I think it's up to the private sector. And one of the things we said today is we hope that the stores, big and small, don't have big Black Friday sales. Of course, the smaller stores can't let people in anyway, so they're not likely to do that unless they do it online, which is fine. But the big stores, I think they're going to have to be responsible for managing their own lineups as they were during the springtime shutdown. And so I hope people will take that responsibility seriously. It only involves putting some marks on the sidewalk. It involves us taking some steps, which I asked be examined, to make the sidewalks passable for people who have to get by when the lineup is there. And we'll be looking at that again because we did in the spring, and I think it worked fairly well. But I think the main initiative there has to come from the private sector. And I can promise you, if somebody calls one of your businesses or anybody else to 311 and says at 463 Dundas Street West, there's a lineup that is, a crowd scene and people are too close and people are this and are that, we'll send somebody out because we're responding to all of those complaints because that's our job.
Great, thank you. This is a question from the restaurant industry. A recent report of infection rates in seniors' homes are over 30% and only 6% for the hospitality industry. Why are restrictions on seniors' homes more restrictive than in restaurants, bars, etc.? I think we should discuss more limitations on hospitality, such as max occupancy, persons per table, temperature checks, masks, etc., versus complete restrictions. Otherwise, by early next year, we'll see a large number of restaurants having to close or declare bankruptcy if they're not able to remain open.
Again, Raymond, thank you for the question, and thanks to the person that sent it in. And I understand the stakes are high. I understand the stakes are high because if this was just starting the first shutdown now, and we hadn't had one before, and we hadn't had the whole year's events, even in the summer when things were slower with regard to indoor dining when it was allowed, then people might be in better shape. But I understand what's happened is those who had reserves of any kind have expended them by now, and probably have some things on their balance sheet that represent, say, rent that's been deferred or something like that, that is sitting there waiting to be dealt with. It's one of the reasons why I was such a loud advocate and a consistent advocate as recently as this morning on the phone with Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, about the supports that are being offered. And just so you're clear, I think many of you will know, the new program that was just passed into law on Friday covers up to 90% of your rent, those that don't own their own premises, 90% of your rent if you're subject to a lockdown order, which you all are now. And secondly, it covers up to 65% of wages under the wage subsidy program. And I fully recognize I'm a business guy. So I know that if you still have very little or no revenue, even if somebody's paying 90% of your rent, it just means your loss is smaller as opposed to that you're going to be making money or even breaking even. But I think this will help people to sustain themselves through the 28-day period. Now, on the comparison between long-term care and restaurants, I can only say this: they're very, very different problems. The reason why there is such a spread or such a higher percentage of the cases that arise out of long-term care starts with the fact that the people who are in long-term care are frail to begin with. They go in there because they need a lot of extra support and care. You then add to that two things, one of which we in our own residences, we own 10 of them, the city, we've rectified this one, which is that there was a pattern that had developed, I think in part because of the nature of how they did business, the long-term care residences, that would have people working in multiple homes on a part-time basis. So they might work 3 days a week at, home number A, and then work 2 days a week at home number B, and maybe even at a third one. That, of course, as you might expect, was almost a prescription for enhancing virus spread, simply because you had people moving from